Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. The 1970s brought in an entire new wave of comic book creators, and among them were some writers who would go on to shape the industry in the following decades. We're talking people like Chris Claremont, Jim Starlin, Steve Englehart, Louise Simonson. The one I want to talk to you today about is Steve Gerber. Gerber was well respected by his peers and acknowledged as a great writer. He may have been writing mainstream superhero stories, but they were loaded with societal commentary and political satire. Among his most remembered creations has to be Howard the Duck, a character no one would have expected to explode in popularity, but he did just that. So today, I want to talk to you about Gerber's creation of Howard the Duck, about his long, protracted battle with Marvel to try to regain the rights to the character he felt he created, and how he slipped one past Marvel right at the end. It was quite the battle. And speaking of battles, let's talk to you real quickly about this episode's sponsor. I want to talk to you folks about Raid Shadow Legends. I play it, probably a bunch of you already play it, but if you don't, there's never been a better time to get into it. It is a free, very fun mobile game, and there are now over 600 champions that you can play in the far-off mystical world of Teleria. It is a blast, and now there's something new. The newest boss just released in Raid is the biggest and craziest yet. This thing is a Hydra with 6 different heads, each with a complete boss battle all on its own. For instance, there's the Head of Torment. This head looks and sounds like a death metal album, which is maybe why it's so terrifying. It specializes in using true fear to drag down your team, making you skip your turns and lose access to your skills. It's insane, and the only way to stop it is to hide. You'll need to bring champions that have Veil or Perfect Veil skills if you want a chance against this head. There's also the Head of Decay. The Head of Decay will slowly weaken your team, all while keeping other heads in good shape. It has attacks and stuff, but they're nothing compared to its passive. Every time you heal one of your champions, they'll actually lose max HP, and it's a nightmare. That would be bad enough, but the Head of Decay can also use a new life barrier buff. When it places a life barrier, it creates a sort of HP shield thing on the target head. And if you can't break the shield in time, the head gets fully healed. It's a real pain to deal with. And if you download the game now, Raid is giving away a limited edition champion to everyone. It's based on Esports Pro Simple. If you sign up between now and January 28th, and log in for 7 consecutive days, you automatically get this new champion. Now, there has never been a better time to download this game, and if you use my link in the description, or scan my QR code pictured there, you will get a free starter pack worth almost $30 to kickstart your game. We're talking a free champion, 200,000 silver, 1 energy refill, 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard, so you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get in-game. All this treasure will be waiting for you here in your in-game inbox. Once you've got it, you can find me in-game as Comic Tropes, and if you're fast, maybe you can join my clan. Again, the link to that game is in the description below. Please check it out. Steve Gerber got a college degree and worked for a time as a copywriter at an ad agency in St. Louis. But he'd always been a comics fan, which included starting a fanzine called Headline in 1961 when he was 13 or 14 years old. It was through that fandom that he met fellow fan Roy Thomas, who would go on to become an editor and writer at Marvel Comics. Gerber approached Thomas in 1972 about working for Marvel. Thomas spoke about it in Alter Ego magazine in 2007, saying, quote, "Steve and I had been in touch off and on. Eventually I got a letter from Steve saying, in essence, 'Help, I'm going crazy in this advertising job.' So I thought, gee, he'd be a good person to get up here. So if he wants to make a change, let's give it a try." He was brought in to be an assistant editor on staff. That didn't work out so well because, for whatever reason, he had trouble staying awake. At the time, he wasn't a staff kind of person, at least in terms of what Marvel needed, but he was a real good writer and did some interesting things. Gerber was part of the bridge between the pulp and camp early comics and the more mature and gritty comics that emerged in the 80s. Before Alan Moore deconstructed the idea of the superhero in the real world in his book Watchmen, Gerber approached a look at what life would be like in the Marvel Universe, which was full of second and third string superheroes. He gave us believable characters in weirdos like Nighthawk and Valkyrie in the pages of Defenders. Gerber created villains whose violence was front and center and provided a shocking contrast to their bizarre looks. For instance, Elf with a Gun in the pages of Defenders was literally just a short guy with a gun who would kill people randomly. He created several versions of Fool Killer, who would kill people for either not being holy enough or for taking life for granted. It was the Punisher dialed up to 11. Gerber also satirized society and comics in books like Daredevil and Defenders. In Daredevil, he created Angar the Screamer, whose voice was augmented, but instead of just being loud, Angar's ranting would drive people to see things that weren't there. You don't have to look too hard to read between the lines to see the metaphor of political activists convincing people to believe them if they yelled loud enough. Long before Grant Morrison went meta in the pages of Animal Man, Steve Gerber included himself within the pages of a Man-Thing story. And in Defenders, you had villains like the Spanker, a principal fired for using corporal punishment on kids. Gerber wasn't above using wordplay, and it's amazing what he snuck past his editors. The title, Giant Size Man-Thing, must have been intentional. He had a character named Dr. Bong in a mainstream comic book, and he'd write lines that still crack me up. One villain was named the Black Hole, and the pros declared that Black Hole sucks. He really did. Gerber's most notable creation is arguably Howard the Duck. Now, a talking, funny animal in a mainstream superhero book might seem incongruous, and yet it proved to be very popular. So popular that Gerber spent a lot of his career after the introduction trying to regain the rights to what he felt he created. But before that, of course, he had to introduce the character. Gerber was briefly a staff editor and then writer in 1972 at Marvel, but by the end of the year moved to purely freelance. That meant everything he was creating at the time was owned by Marvel under their work-for-hire agreement. By 1976, the laws on that got codified more clearly, and creators had to be notified in writing up front about the nature of work for hire, but until then, things were looser. Marvel tried to cover their bases with a legally dubious method. The back of the paychecks they issued to creators, which had to be signed to be deposited, released all intellectual property rights to Marvel. This is an example of a check like that. It's part of the public record from a later lawsuit we'll discuss, and all the legal documents I'll refer to were produced thanks to the hard work of writer R.S. Martin. The check reads in part, quote, "By endorsement of this check, I, the payee, acknowledge full payment for my employment by Magazine Management Company Incorporated, and for my assignment to it of any copyright, trademark, and any other rights in or related to the material and including my assignment of any rights to renewal copyright." Gerber began writing Man-Thing, Marvel's swamp monster character, beginning in issue 11 of Adventure into Fear, cover dated December of 1972. Among his important additions to the character's world were the narration, "Whatever knows fear burns at the touch of Man-Thing," the sorcerer Dakeem, empathic sorcerer in training, Jennifer Kale, and the concept of the nexus of all realities, a point in the Florida Everglades from which other dimensional threats would emerge and which Man-Thing would mindlessly keep under control. In issue 19, Dakeem guided Man-Thing and Jennifer on an adventure with other beings that entered through the Nexus. These included Barbarian Korak and Howard the Duck. He was illustrated and co-created by artist Val Mayerick, who gave Howard his suit and tie and cigar. For Gerber, he was trying to come up with a visual gag, but the talking animal idea did not fly with editorial. In an interview with Comic Book Artist No. 7, Gerber explains that Roy Thomas asked him to remove the character immediately, and so, in the following issue of the story, which was Man-Thing No. 1, Howard unceremoniously fell off a pathway into a dimensional void. However, the feedback from readers was strong. They liked Howard. Marvel's official fan magazine Foom interviewed Steve Gerber in their September 1976 issue, and Gerber explained that fan response, saying, quote, "People were taken with him immediately. The office was flooded with letters." He even relayed a story of one fan sending Marvel a duck carcass. Steve Gerber brought Howard back in a backup story in the pages of Giant-Size Man-Thing issues 4 and 5, where Howard dealt with absurdist threats like Bessie, a cow that Dracula turned into a vampire. The response was strong, so Marvel gave Howard the Duck his own title in September of 1975 as a bi-monthly title. It started with a small print run, but sold well. Marvel issued a Treasury edition that featured a new Howard the Duck story as well as reprints of his first appearances. And by issue 7, the title moved to monthly. Print orders had increased to around 400,000 copies from the 275,000 copies of issue 1. Howard was a hit. Gerber was clearly having a good time. He would parody things like Star Wars and the presidential election, whatever was popular at the time. But even though it was absurd and funny, there was also an underlying element of sadness to it because Howard was in a world he didn't belong in. There was an existential sadness, a theme about trying to fit in. Anyway, the book was doing very, very well. Gerber was having a good time, but there were some problems brewing behind the scenes. Frank Brunner was the first artist on the Howard series, but he and Gerber didn't have a smooth working relationship. One issue was that at the time, Marvel would give 2 of the original pages of art from each issue to the writer and divide the majority of the pages in a 2/3 split between the penciler and inker. Most writers would give their 2 pages to the illustrator, but Gerber wasn't one of them. Brunner also wanted to be credited as a co-plotter, which would be financially beneficial, especially for reprints, but Gerber was resistant. On top of all this, Gerber was apparently very slow to give him the script and gave it to him a few pages at a time instead of the entire story. Brunner has said in interviews that it made it difficult for him to pace the story because without the entire story, he didn't know where to give space to big moments. The straw that broke the camel's back was when he asked for a page rate increase and Marvel said no. John Buscema stepped in for issue 3, and then Gene Colan became the regular penciler beginning with issue 4. Brunner did understand the popularity of Howard and created his own duck-themed merchandise, including a poster and a comic. Gerber was aware and asked for a share of the profits, but Brunner did not grant him any, arguing he hadn't written anything for the merchandise. Instead, Gerber decided to launch some of his own merchandise, some buttons for Howard running for president, which was also a storyline in the comics. Gerber licensed the rights to make these buttons from Marvel, and it's worth noting that part of that agreement that Gerber signed stated explicitly that the licensee, Gerber, was acknowledging that Marvel owned the full rights to Howard the Duck, and also he would not challenge that ownership. The button was advertised in the 4th issue of Howard the Duck and promoted heavily with the 8th issue, which began the storyline of Howard running for president. The following issue added editorship to Gerber's titles. Behind the scenes, Marvel had recently allowed Jerry Conway to step down from editor-in-chief and gave him a bunch of titles to write and edit, including Daredevil, to make up for the loss in income. Gerber had been writing Daredevil, so to help offset the loss of his income, Gerber was given a freelance editing job on his title, Howard the Duck. He could now guide the book with very little oversight as both writer and editor. Gerber was on top of the world with Howard the Duck. In 1977, he also added a Howard the Duck comic strip in newspapers to his paycheck. But that was also the year that Disney finally took notice of this new duck character. In 1980, writer Stephen Grant explained the story behind Disney's involvement in the pages of issue 8 of Howard the Duck magazine. With the new comics and merchandise, Disney's worldwide licensees who sold Donald Duck merchandise complained about this new popular duck character. Disney contacted Marvel and the companies reached an agreement to redesign Howard slightly. Disney sent over proposed design changes, shown here, and Marvel's art director John Romita Sr. issued a memo explaining the new design adjustments to everyone. The main thing Disney was looking for was to have Howard wear pants, and so it came to pass that in issue 21 of Howard the Duck, Howard wore pants. Of course, Gerber cleverly couched it all within the context of a story that satirized anti-pornography activists. And yet, Howard ended the issue discarding the pants, and they would never return for the rest of Gerber's run as writer and editor. If you're curious how Steve Gerber could get away with ignoring these changes that Marvel and Disney had agreed to, just understand that Marvel in the mid-70s was very chaotic. They were dealing with chronically late books. They were dealing with a rotating editor-in-chief role. It just kept being filled by new people in short periods of time. And they even, for instance, had to deal with, in January of 1978, there was new U.S. copyright law. Marvel didn't implement that until May, several months later. So the last thing that any executives or lawyers had time for was to look over Steve Gerber's shoulder to see exactly what he was doing. But pretty soon, they weren't going to be able to ignore what Gerber was doing. In 1978, Gerber wrote some issues of Mr. Miracle for DC Comics. Marvel decided they wanted to keep Gerber exclusive to them, and instead of working freelance, offered him a contract to write and edit exclusively for Marvel. His yearly salary for just the comics, not the comic strip or licensed products, came to $16,818 a year. Today, that would be the equivalent of about $72,000 a year. It was a very healthy contract that said, among other things, Gerber had the right of first refusal for any new Howard the Duck projects Marvel would create. But it also specifically said he'd have that right while being employed by them, a small but important detail. Within 6 months of the new contract, Gerber's previously mentioned lateness became a big issue. Marvel terminated him from the newspaper comic strip first. Gerber claims he resigned from that job because the payments to artist Gene Colan were too slow. But both Gene Colan and his successor on the newspaper strip, Val Mayerick, have both gone on record as saying the big issue was how slow Gerber was to deliver scripts. Here's Mayerick, in his own words, explaining the situation in an excerpt from a 2012 interview by James Hudnall.
Then what happened ultimately was that Steve was also doing the Howard the Duck newspaper strip, and Gene Colan was doing that, was drawing that. And Steve, who was just notoriously late, I don't know if there's anybody in the industry that was ever as late as Steve, had gotten himself so bound up in tardiness that Gene just got fed up and he couldn't take it anymore because he just couldn't draw fast enough to keep compensating for Steve not meeting deadlines. So he dropped out, and Archie Goodwin called me and said, "Do you want to take this over?" And I thought, at the time I didn't have a whole lot of work. I just gotten to New York, and I said, "Yeah, I'll do it."
Things got testy at this point, with Gerber having his attorney demand a written termination letter and his acknowledgement to Marvel that he believed he held the rights to all the material he created for the newspaper strip. In part, Gerber's reply stated, quote, "Please regard this as a formal notice that I, and not Marvel, am and shall be the exclusive owner of the comic character Howard the Duck and of all other characters, plots, themes, and settings created by me or under my authority which have been included in the comic strip." After receiving this response, Marvel cracked down. Gerber was already so late on his scripts that new editor-in-chief Jim Shooter had removed him from the Captain America title, just to get that one back on track and let him focus on Howard the Duck. But now even Howard the Duck was slow, and if he was going to challenge Marvel legally, well, they just couldn't be paying him to fund their own legal fees. Marvel had to act. Marvel opted to cut their losses. Marvel publisher Stan Lee sent Gerber a termination letter, and Gerber was now off the Howard the Duck comic books. From there, Gerber transitioned into a new career, working as a writer and story editor for cartoons including G.I. Joe, Transformers, and Dungeons & Dragons. Gerber next became involved with Howard the Duck 2 years later in 1980, when he learned that Marvel was licensing the character to a production company to develop TV, film, and radio projects. Gerber sent a notice that he owned the character and would be owed licensing fees. Gerber hired a lawyer to send Marvel a cease and desist letter. A lawsuit was filed against Marvel in August of that year. Marvel petitioned to have the lawsuit thrown out, but a judge dismissed that one, and it was mentioned as an initial win for Gerber in the pages of the Comics Journal. In order to help fund his lawsuit, Gerber launched a new Duck comic, Destroyer Duck, through Eclipse Comics. It was an anthology, and Gerber recruited some big names to help him battle Marvel, including Jack Kirby. Destroyer Duck follows a tough duck named Duke from Duck World, whose little friend had gone missing, implied to be Howard. Duke tracks down the abduction to God World, a company who was exploiting him. A thinly veiled jab at Marvel. The book came out intermittently, and there were ultimately 9 issues. Meanwhile, both sides of the legal battle proved difficult to pin down for depositions before the case was heard, and each ended up paying the other side some lawyer's fees for such trouble. In May of 1982, the judge ruled on some of the claims from Marvel. It led to Marvel and Gerber quietly settling out of court shortly after that. The terms of that deal have never been disclosed. By 1984, Marvel was employing Gerber on a freelance writing basis again, although not on Howard the Duck. There was a 1986 live-action movie that credits Howard the Duck as Steve Gerber's creation, although the film was savaged by critics and bombed at the box office. It was tonally all over the place, with a kid-friendly vibe at some points, and then sex jokes and horror in others. In 1985, Gerber was hired to script a new Howard the Duck story, and he used his script to essentially erase elements that later writers had added, like Bill Mantlow's version of Duck World. Editor-in-chief Jim Shooter heavily rewrote it, and Gerber was allegedly furious. The Comics Journal showed a side-by-side comparison of the original and revised scripts in issue 110 from August of 1985. The book never got made, and Shooter himself took shots at Gerber in Secret Wars 2. Shooter wrote a stand-in character for Gerber who was working in cartoons, and who was given cosmic power and immediately becomes a supervillain who destroys the workplace of someone who had revised his work. Gerber would next write Howard the Duck in 1990. He was writing She-Hulk, and he included Howard the Duck as a guest star in 4 issues. Then, well, you gotta consider, Steve Gerber was not a lawyer. He was a writer. He wanted the rights back to Howard. He decided to use the skills he did have in 1996 in a very sneaky way. In 1996, Editor-in-Chief Bob Harris assigned editor Tom Brevoort the task of having Howard the Duck appear in a Spider-Man team-up book. Brevoort approached Gerber to write it. Gerber had ambitious plans, including an unofficial crossover with Eric Larson's Image comic Savage Dragon, which was going to have a one-shot featuring Gerber's creation Destroyer Duck. The story would take place in the same location, but Spider-Man and Dragon wouldn't officially meet. Brevoort was apprehensive about this and wrote about it in a blog post titled 5 Comics That Almost Got Me Fired. He wrote, quote, "I was uneasy about not knowing what would be in the Dragon Destroyer book, and I said so. Gerber gave me his word that he wouldn't do anything in that story that would cause me any problems, and so, like a sucker, I agreed to go along with it." In the Spider-Man story, Gerber had Howard and Howard's girlfriend Beverly end up in a fight with some supervillains in a warehouse. The Dragon and Destroyer Duck pop up, but are either shown in silhouette or in close-ups. Spider-Man and Howard battle the circus of crime, and in the middle, Howard bumps into a fellow duck. The heroes chase some villains out of the warehouse, but over in the Savage Dragon story, we see things from a different angle. A new panel showed that there are hundreds of duck clones in the warehouse. As the warehouse is about to explode, Dragon and Duke save Howard and Beverly. Dragon says they should return them to their friends, but Duke says there were some clones that ran out the other way, and no one will know the difference. The issue ends with Howard and Beverly disguising themselves and entering witness protection. There was no legal fallout, but Brevoort has said in interviews he felt betrayed. Gerber wrote a story that technically says that the Howard in Marvel's universe is now a clone. However, Gerber did return to write one more Howard the Duck story in 2002 for Marvel, so apparently there were no lasting hard feelings. Gerber also apologized to Brevoort on his blog in 2007. In 2008, Gerber passed away from complications due to pulmonary fibrosis. He was only 60 years old. Gerber may not have been much of a businessman, and he certainly hadn't read his contracts very closely, but he was a really good writer. His contemporaries all agree on that, and I think we can at least be grateful for the output he left us with, chief among them, Howard the Duck. And another comic I didn't get into here, Omega the Unknown. His co-writer on that was Mary Screens, and she commented on Steve in Sean Howe's book, Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, in what I think functions well as an obituary. She said, quote, "There are some people who could only write. That's all they could do. Steve, unfortunately, was one. And people should know comics are a place to start and then move on, but he didn't like animation, and he didn't like television. He liked comic books." Before I leave, I again want to thank blogger R.S. Martin. If you want to read the legal details of this, he goes into much, much further detail there. It's really good reading. If you're looking for where to start with Steve Gerber, I think I'd strongly recommend Omega the Unknown and Defenders. Of course, Howard the Duck. Very different types of stories, but all of them really, really solid. None of them so long that it's hard to keep up. Anyway, I think that Gerber was a really interesting writer. It's too bad that we didn't get more from him. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to all of you for hitting things like and subscribe. Thank you to this week's sponsor, and a special thanks to all of my patrons. You guys really do make this show possible. I'll see you next week, and until then, keep reading comics. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please consider hitting like and subscribe. If you'd like to support the show, there are merchandise links beneath the YouTube video, and you can always hit join on YouTube or visit Comic Tropes on Patreon to get access to special perks.